Let's review the study guide 5. Let's start by looking at the blood chapter. Remember, blood pH was about 7.35 to 7.45. This is an incredibly small margin and quite impressive that it can be held within such a narrow range. The protein that we found in blood plasma, which contributed to the osmotic pressure, so the inward pulling force, was albumin. And within the red blood cells, we saw that majority of its dry weight, about 96 to 98%, was hemoglobin. And we remember that red blood cells, which are also known as erythrocytes, are very numerous, about 45% of the blood volume. This makes about 5 million red blood cells in a cubic millimeter of blood. We discussed how normal red blood cells had these nice biconcaved disc shape, so looking like a flattened balloon or a donut. Then we have also this condition known as sickle cell disease, where the red blood cells were instead shaped like crescent moon. Polycythemia referred to the red blood cell disorder resulting from a life at high altitude. With it, we see overproduction of red blood cells, which thickens the blood and slows its flow, thus increasing the risk of clots, strokes, and heart attacks. White blood cells instead are known as leukocytes. They were far less common, only about less than 1% in healthy individuals. Of course, their number can increase if one gets sick. And white blood cells moved easily in and out of the blood vessels with a process known as diabetes. Abnormally low levels of white blood cells were known as a condition called leukopenia. Leukemia instead was when we had high number of those, but they may not be functional. So both a bad situation. Classify white blood cells in two groups, granulocytes and agranulocytes. Granulocytes, so neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils, have cytoplasm that appears dotted. Their nucleus has multiple lobes. Agranulocytes instead have not. These are lymphocytes and monocytes. Formed elements refer to the cells or parts of the cells that make the blood, so not only plasma matrix, but the red blood cells, white blood cells, and the platelets. They originated from the hemocytoblast. The part hemo refers to the blood, cyto to the cell, and blast to the developing or immature cell. The process that stops bleeding was known as hemostasis. Then we talked about blood clots known as thrombus. When they break free and start to travel in the bloodstream, that was known as an embolus. Very dangerous if it blocks a vessel, for example, in the lungs or brain, thus preventing the transport of oxygen and nutrients downstream. Condition where the platelets were not formed in sufficient quantities was known as thrombocytopenia. This causes easy bruising, prolonged bleeding, and so on. Hemophilia, in fact, resulted from the lack of clotting factor. and it was genetic inherited disorder. Then you might remember that on the surface of cells was these little markers known as antigens. They signal that, hey, this cell belongs into your body. And those were detected by antibodies, which act on these invaders too. And while I use the antigens on the surface of red blood cells to explain blood types, we see antigens on the surface of all cells. This in turn helped us to establish who can donate blood to who. And from the APO blood grouping system, we saw that individuals with blood type O were considered as universal donors because we could give their blood to all recipients, because we would not introduce something that they do not already have. If one had both antigens A and B, they were blood type AB. If only A, then they were A blood type. If only B, then B blood type. And these individuals without any of these antigens on their blood cell surface were blood type O. Then we also talked about the presence of RH, and these individuals were RH positive. If it was not there, they are RH negative. We also see sometimes that fetuses' red blood cells are destroyed at a faster rate than their liver can remove those breakdown products that cause the childhood newborn jaundice. It typically passes away. Few matching questions here. The condition known as leukocytosis referred to having too many leukocytes. The leukocyte then was white blood cell. These cells contain prominent nucleus, which we used to identify them, as we saw earlier. Erythrocytes, so red blood cells, can transport both oxygen and carbon dioxide, although majority of carbon dioxide was transported as a bicarbonate. The number of erythrocytes, so red blood cells, was controlled by a hormone called erythropoietin, so we saw this was sometimes used as doping. Remember EPO. Erythrocytes are also the most common cell type in the blood, and the cell fragments known as platelets were responsible for blood clotting. I have here two questions for you to think more about. So there are two potential reasons why Scott would have too many blood cells. One of these was a condition polycythemia vera. In this condition, bone marrow creates too many blood cells. And the other one is if there is chronic low oxygen levels, so condition known as hypoxemia due to factors like smoking, lung disease, or high altitude. We saw that the antigens and antibodies, as we were exploring blood groups, antigens was what was shown on the surface of the red blood cell, and antibodies are responsible for dealing with that. Okay, on the next page, we see a diagram comparing and contrasting the cardiovascular system and lymphatic system. Remember, cardiovascular system was a closed one-way system starting from the heart, then arteries and arterioles, eventually capillaries, where the exchange of materials took place. Then from there, blood returns via venules and veins back to the heart. Lymphatic system is instead open one-way system. The open end is at the tissues, picking up that interstitial fluid, which then gets carried towards the heart. So let's see the parts. Lymphatic capillaries are shown as D in this diagram. Lymph nodes were those bean-shaped nodules, often located as clusters along the lymphatic vessels, shown as B on this diagram. And lymphatic duct, so the largest type of the tube in this system emptying next to the heart, is shown as A. Blood capillaries instead were shown as E on this diagram. Remember, some fluid escaped from these all the time to the interstitial space. And finally, collecting vessels would be C on here. See the valves in those. On the next page, we see major lymphatic organs. The spleen is shown as C, located on the left side of the superior abdominal cavity, tucked there behind or to the side of the stomach. Tonsils are shown with A. Many of them are located around the oral area there. And thymus was this organ that was located at the anterior neck and chest, and it did get replaced by adipose and connective tissues as you aged, shown here as B. Letter D shows the Peyer's patches. They were in intestines, a little like tonsils if you want to draw that analog. Remember, it was spleen that was responsible for removing old red blood cells, and tonsils served the purpose of removing bacteria that was entering through the throat. Then the next question starts a series of filling blank questions. We saw that plasma escaped from the blood and became interstitial fluid. When that was captured by lymphatic vessels, it became lymph. On the next page, the excessive buildup of fluid, this interstitial space, so space between the cells in the tissues, that was known as edema. Thoracic duct was this prominent duct running at the back of the thoracic cavity. We saw lymph nodes in great numbers at the groin, so inguinal, armpit, so axillary, and neck, so cervical region. We talked about how important spleen was for removing old, worn out blood cells. We saw the term MULT. In this chapter, I used an umbrella term of pathogen to describe any invader that should not be in the body naturally. So things like bacteria, viruses, parasites, fungi, and so on. We looked at signs and symptoms of inflammation. These were redness, pain, warmth, and swelling on the sides. I would also add here loss of function. Remember how our body protection worked through multiple lines of defense, keeping the pathogen from getting into the body through a barrier like skin was the first one, chemicals like sweat, stomach acid, and tears, the second line of defense, and finally, lymphocytes, so B and T cells, were the third line of response. Purgins instead refer to the chemicals secreted by white blood cells and macrophages. They help in fever, to increase body temperature. We also discussed vaccines as a form of immunity. There were 5 major classes of immunoglobulins, known as immunoglobulin M, A, D, C, and E. Killer T cells that are invaded by viruses, they were known therefore cytotoxic. We saw that allergies were abnormally strong responses to otherwise fairly normal reaction, thanks to the immune system overreacting, if you wish. And totally over the top reaction that we saw was the anaphylactic shock. Then our very last page gives us a few different types of activities. Spleen, marked with letter D here, is the organ located on the left side of the abdominal cavity, kind of behind the stomach. Tonsils were responsible for trapping and removing bacteria and pathogens that would enter through the throat. Thymus was this gland that rested on the lower neck and largely on the chest, a little over the heart. It did shrink as you aged, though. And again, spleen was responsible for cleaning blood from old cells. And tonsils, we already saw, located at the throat area. We remember that antigens were like those little signal flags on the surface of a cell communicating that this is what type of a cell that I am. So you could then either detect it as part of itself or not. Interferons are small proteins that bind with the receptors on the healthy cells to promote protein synthesis and prevent viruses from binding. Pyrogens, instead, chemicals secreted by white blood cells and macrophages. Those raise the body temperature in fever. Pathogens was this umbrella term that I used to refer to any disease causing microorganism like virus, bacteria, and parasite. And finally, antibodies, shown as J here, were responsible for detecting and acting on antigens. Finally, two potential essay topics you could compare: innate immunity and adaptive immunity. Innate was the one that you are born with and gives general responses against all types of pathogens, while adaptive, or acquired as we call it in the UK, was specific responses but needed first encountering that pathogen so that it gets primed. Inflammation, again, had 4, or I preferred 5 signs and symptoms. The site gets red as more blood rushes into there. This also brings heat with it and causes tissue to swell. This causes pain as the tissue is filled over full. And finally, the loss of function was important so that the site has a chance to rest and heal.